Throughout the centuries, there have been many kings and queens of England who were known for the wrong reasons. Take King Henry VIII, for example. His changes to England and his 6 wives cemented him as one of the most infamous kings in history. There was also King Richard III, who was actually discovered in his grave 500 years after he was slain in battle. But there are many kings and queens of Britain who are actually buried together in the same vaults. For example, Queen Elizabeth I and Mary I, the 2 Tudor queens who ruled in their own right, are actually buried one on top of the other. Their coffins strategically placed to symbolise Elizabeth I's power over her half-sister, even in death. And in this video, we look at what the inside of some of these royal vaults are like and discovered what was found when people dared to peer inside of British royal burial vaults. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Westminster Abbey's story begins in the 11th century. King Edward the Confessor, one of the last Anglo-Saxon kings, ordered the construction of a great stone church near his palace at Westminster. It was completed in 1065, just days before his death, and he was buried within it, a sign that this would be no ordinary church. When William the Conqueror was crowned there a year later, a tradition was born. Every English and British monarch since 1066, except for Edward V and Edward VIII, has been crowned in Westminster Abbey. Over the centuries, its chapels became filled with royal monuments and burials. By the Middle Ages, it had earned the title the House of Kings. But space within the main church was limited. As each generation of monarchs sought a fitting place to rest, burials extended below ground, into crypts and sealed vaults. These became the final resting places of some of the most famous and infamous figures in British royal history. At the very heart of the abbey stands the shrine of Edward the Confessor. Canonised as a saint in 1161, his body lies in a raised tomb of marble and mosaic, surrounded by what is known as the Royal Chapel. Around him were buried some of England's earliest kings and queens, eager to rest close to a saint. Here lie Henry III, who rebuilt the abbey in its present Gothic form in the 13th century, Edward I, or Longshanks, and Edward III, Victor of Crequi, and founder of the Order of the Garter. The tombs of their queens, Eleanor of Castile, Philippa of Hainault, and Anne of Bohemia, surround them. These burials were not in underground vaults, but in grand stone tombs visible to pilgrims and visitors. The vaults themselves, chambers sealed below these chapels, came later, as space grew scarce and the needs of royal burials changed. By the early 1500s, Westminster Abbey was overflowing with tombs when Henry VII decided to build his own chapel. He created not only one of the most beautiful examples of late Gothic architecture in Europe, but also a royal burial vault beneath it. The Henry VII Lady Chapel, at the eastern end of the abbey, was completed in 1519. Its fan-vaulted ceiling, adorned with Tudor roses and symbols of dynastic triumph, hides a large crypt below. Henry VII was the first Tudor king, and he built his chapel to symbolise the legitimacy of his new dynasty after decades of civil war. In the vault beneath his magnificent tomb lie Henry VII and his wife, Elizabeth of York, the marriage that united the warring houses of Lancaster and York. Their polished gilt bronze effigies, made by the Italian sculptor Pietro Tolentino, rest above them. The same chapel would later hold the remains of many Tudor and Stuart monarchs, most famously Mary I and Elizabeth I, the half-sisters who once ruled opposing religious realms, were buried together in the north aisle of Henry VII's chapel. The irony is striking. 2 queens who stood for rival visions of England now share the same tomb, their effigies carved in eternal peace. The Latin inscription between them simply reads, "Partners in throne and grave. Here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of resurrection. The 17th century was an age of turbulence, civil war, regicide and restoration. Westminster Abbey's royal vault reflects this chaos. When King James I, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, died in 1625, he was buried in Henry VII's chapel, marking the start of the Stuart dynasty's use of the vault. The vault also holds the remains of William III and Mary II, the co-monarchs who replaced James II after the Glorious Revolution, as well as Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts. In total, 15 kings and queens are buried in or beneath Henry VII's chapel, making it one of the most significant royal necropolises in the world. Yet not every Stuart monarch found rest here. Charles I, executed in 1649 after the Civil War, was denied burial in Westminster Abbey by Oliver Cromwell's government. He was laid to rest in St George's Chapel at Windsor, a reminder that even kings could be refused entry to the royal vaults. When the Hanoverian dynasty succeeded the Stuarts in 1714, royal burials gradually shifted away from Westminster Abbey, yet some members of the early Hanoverian family were still interred there, in vaults that remain sealed and largely unseen today. The most notable of these is the South Aisle Vault of Henry VII's chapel, where George II, the last monarch to be buried at Westminster Abbey, was laid to rest in 1760 beside his beloved Queen, Caroline of Ansbach. Their burial vault is remarkable for one touching detail. Their 2 lead coffins were placed side by side, with sides removed so that, even in death, their remains could lie together, united forever. After George II's royal burials moved permanently to St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, beginning with George III, Westminster Abbey was simply too full, and the newer monarchs preferred Windsor's privacy. But the Abbey's vaults remained a sacred resting place for centuries of predecessors. Beneath the floors of Westminster Abbey lies a maze of sealed crypts, vaults and passageways, each containing multiple lead-lined coffins. These vaults were never meant to be seen by the public. Their entrances are hidden beneath marble slabs, monuments and iron grills. The vaults vary in size. Some contain only a few members of one royal family, others hold dozens. For example, the Tudor vault under Henry VII's tomb is a large stone chamber holding not only the king and queen, but also several of their children who died young. The Stuart vault nearby holds monarchs, queens, consorts and royal relatives from over a century of dynastic rule. Inside, the air would be heavy and still. The coffins are stacked on stone shelves or placed side by side, many bearing simple lead nameplates, and over time, some have decayed or collapsed. In a few cases, when restoration work was carried out in the 19th and 20th centuries, workers caught brief glimpses of these royal remains. Records describe the careful resealing of vaults and ensuring that no disturbance would occur again. So, who lies where? A roll call of royal dead. To step through Westminster Abbey's chapels is to walk above some of the greatest names in English history. Here are just a few of those buried beneath the stone. Edward the Confessor died in 1066. He was founder of the abbey and canonised a saint and buried in his shrine. Then there's Henry III, who died in 1272, rebuilder of the abbey and buried near to the Confessor. Then there's Edward I, Longshanks, died in 1307, the warrior king of Scotland campaigns. And then there's Edward III, who died in 1377, founder of the Order of the Garter. Henry V, who died in 1422, hero of Agincourt, buried beneath his chantry chapel. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York died in 1509 and 1503, founders of the Tudor dynasty. Edward VI died 1553, the boy king, son of Henry VIII, buried in the Confessor's Chapel. Mary I and Elizabeth I died in 1558 and 1603, half-sisters sharing one tomb. James I died 1625, the first Stuart King of England. Charles II died 1685, the Merry Monarch, buried without pomp. William III and Mary II died 1702 and 1694, joint rulers after the Glorious Revolution. Queen Anne died 1714, the last Stuart monarch. George II and Queen Caroline died 1760 and 1737, last monarchs to be buried in the Abbey. It is extraordinary to think that beneath a single building lies the remains of nearly all the monarchs who shaped medieval, Tudor and early modern Britain. Although known as the Royal Peculiar, Westminster Abbey is also home to graves of poets, scientists and statesmen. Poets' Corner, for example, contains the remains of Geoffrey Chaucer, Charles Dickens, Rudyard Kipling and others. Nearby lie Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin, men who changed how humanity understood the world. The mix of monarchs and minds makes the Abbey not just a royal burial ground but a national pantheon, a place where Britain commemorates its most significant figures, whether of crown or pen. The royal vaults, though sealed, have not always escaped disturbance. During the English Civil War, parliamentarian soldiers ransacked parts of the Abbey. The medieval shrine of Edward the Confessor was damaged, and some royal tombs were desecrated. In later centuries, restorers and antiquarians occasionally opened vaults for inspection and repair, and one notable instance occurred in 1867 when workmen repairing the floor of Henry VII's chapel accidentally broke into a royal vault. They found within it several coffins, stacked and labelled, their metal corroded but still intact. The discovery was quietly resealed and no further entry was permitted. Even today, the Abbey authorities guard these vaults closely. Their contents are known through old records and drawings, but very few have ever been photographed or examined in modern times. Today, Westminster Abbey remains at the centre of royal ceremony. Every coronation, from William the Conqueror to King Charles III, has taken place just above those ancient vaults. The building connects the living monarchy with its departed ancestors, and during funerals such as those of Queen Elizabeth I, Charles II or Queen Anne, mourners would watch as the coffin was lowered through a trapdoor into the vault below. Bells tolled, prayers were said, and the stone was sealed forever. The same steps were followed centuries later for figures like Sir Isaac Newton and Stephen Hawking, their ashes buried within the Abbey. The vault may be full, but the Abbey continues to receive new interments in its walls and floors, a continuing story of British history in stone and bone. Inside the royal vaults of Westminster Abbey lies an entire hidden world, a silent kingdom beneath the living one. Kings who fought each other in life now rest within feet of each other in death. Queens who ruled over rival faiths share the same chamber. The Abbey's echoing vaults tell a story not only of monarchy, but of the passing of time itself, from Saxon saints to Tudor splendour, from Stuart tragedy to Georgian elegance. Every slab of marble hides a fragment of that history. Though the public will never walk among these shadowed chambers, the idea that beneath Westminster's familiar floor lies the dust of England's greatest rulers gives the Abbey its haunting, almost sacred power. It is, quite literally, the burial heart of the British nation, where history sleeps beneath our feet. The royal vault that sits under St George's Chapel today is considered full or close to it, with the coffins of dozens of royals and minor royals inside of it. But what is this, and what does it look like? As a building, St George's Chapel is known as a royal peculiar. It is a building that is under the direct authority of royalty and the monarchy, and it does not necessarily fall inside of a parish. Over the centuries, it became a place where many people were interred and buried, and there were many different chapels that were created inside of St George's for smaller worship and dedication to royals. A chapel was made in Windsor Castle's walls and was rededicated to George the Martyr,
but it then became known as St George's Chapel. Throughout the Wars of the Roses and the early Tudor period, there was extensive redevelopment to the building, but during the English Civil War, there was a lot of destruction in the building. There was pillaging and plundering by parliamentarian forces, but following the execution of King Charles I, the executed king was buried there, alongside Henry VIII, who had been buried with his third wife, Jane Seymour, in a specially built vault. Further changes and restoration was made throughout the reigns of the Georgians and Queen Victoria. One of the first monarchs buried inside of St George's was Edward IV, and it stated that he was to be buried in a vault with a chapel or closest over it, with space for an altar and a tomb with his figure of silver and gilt, or at least copper and gilt. The will further provided for a chantry of 2 priests and for the company of 13 poor bedsmen to live within the college. The king's bones were left for a number of centuries, but they were then discovered when work was done to repair and change parts of St George's to the wishes of King George III. Edward IV had been buried inside one of the first royal vaults, and the vault itself was small, 9 feet long and under 4 feet wide, and it had a number of arches in it. The remains of a wooden coffin with the skull and bones of Elizabeth Woodville lay on top of a lead coffin, and these had been put in there. The coffin of Edward IV was opened, and his complete skeleton was found, and even shoulder-length brown hair was found on his head. One eyewitness claimed that, when the coffin was opened, the body bore its natural form but soon fell to powder. The point of this is that there were actually a number of individual burial vaults for the royals found inside of the chapel. However, King George III ordered the excavation and building of a proper royal burial vault underneath the floor of the chapel. This became known as the Tomb House, and inside of this vault are a number of different shelves which are held behind iron bars, and today there are 25 bodies of members of the royal family who are buried in their coffins in this part of the royal vault. The bodies are literally slid onto the shelves and then have been left in this manner. One of the first people to be buried in the royal vault was Princess Charlotte in 1817, and she died following giving birth. The tomb house holds the remains of many different royals, including King George III, George IV, William IV, and many of their grandchildren, children, and other family members. The first to be interred in the royal vault was Princess Amelia in 1810, the daughter of George III and his wife Charlotte. There is near to the shelf a few central plinths, and the coffins of a number of kings and queens were placed in the centre, highlighting their importance. Some images of the royal vault even show the coffins carrying a number of crowns. Throughout the centuries, there were some rearrangements and changes to the royal vault, and different monarchs could stipulate the arrangements and organisation of the different coffins. Some had coffins placed on the racking at the side, and others had closer relatives on the plinths in the central point. With regards to gaining access to the royal vault, there is one which is accessed by a staircase for those who have clearance, for example the priests who regularly go and pray down there, but the other entry is through an elevator or a lift mechanism in the central part of the chapel, and this is a hole in the floor which comes up and down, bringing coffins into the royal vault. Coffins are lowered to a chamber below, and this is connected to the royal vault. When the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II took place, the body of the Queen was lowered symbolically into said royal vault, using the electronic lift. Her incredibly heavy coffin was then brought back out of the vault hours after the funeral had taken place, because she was to be buried inside of a small chantry chapel alongside her father, King George VI, and her mother. The remains of Elizabeth II were then interred here. Philip, her consort, Prince Philip as he was better known, had his coffin held inside the royal vault for roughly a year, and this was done so that there would not be 2 separate interments inside of the memorial chapel. Someone must have known that the Queen did not have long left, or the plan was to always hold Philip's body in the royal vault before burying him with his wife together. The process for burials inside of the royal vault was as followed. The funeral service would take place inside of St George's Chapel, followed by the committal, and this would see the coffin being lowered into the royal vault using the lift fitted into the chapel near to the altar. The coffin was then either placed on the central part of the vault or it was stored away on the different shelvings held behind the iron railings. The vault itself is believed to have been rather cool. It is not refrigerated, leading to the conclusion that the remains tend to stay in a good sense of preservation due to the temperature. There are other small vaults as mentioned, but these are not the actual royal vault, for example Henry VIII's vault, and also Elizabeth II's.
The chapel of St Peter ad Vincula today sits very close to the oldest part of the Tower of London, known as the White Tower. It was founded around the year 1110 by Henry I, and to begin with, this chapel was outside of the original walls of the Tower of London, and it was built so that the king could worship in public and that the people of London could see their monarch undertaking his religious duties. The small chapel continued to be used for many years, and as the Tower of London expanded and underwent huge renovations, the curtain walls enveloped and swallowed the chapel up so that it would be forever within the fortress as it still is today. But the church today contains many different monuments and dedications, including those who governed the tower and looked after the day-to-day running of it, but the church is the burial place to some of the most famous prisoners who were held under lock and key, including 2 of Henry VIII's queens and wives and the 9-day queen. Anne Boleyn was the second wife of Henry VIII, and her downfall was plotted by Thomas Cromwell, as the king wanted to rid of Anne and he wanted to marry Jane Seymour. Anne was accused of incest, treason and adultery, and she would be executed inside the Tower of London on the 19th of May, 1536. Anne Boleyn had her head struck clean off of her shoulders by an expert executioner and swordsman who had been brought over from France. Anne, following her execution, was then placed into an oak chest used for bow staves, and her body was then taken into the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula. There was no huge funeral, but she was quietly thrown into a grave near to the altar, and her ladies watched as the earth was thrown over her remains. Anne's burial inside of the chapel was the first of a royal who had been executed inside the tower's walls, and she was the first royal to be interred there. Kings and queens had died inside the tower walls before, but, well, for example, King Henry VI was murdered there, and also Elizabeth of York died inside the tower giving birth, but these 2 were both buried elsewhere. The chapel of St Peter ad Vincula was not intended to be a site of royal burial at all. The next royal who lost her head inside the tower was Henry VIII's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, and she had been condemned to death for cheating on the king and for treason. Catherine Howard was not executed by sword, but instead was executed by the commoner's axe, which was said to have been less reliable and more problematic. This took place on the 13th of February, 1542, and the skilled axeman took her head off in one clean blow. After her execution, her remains were collected up in a sheet, and they were then taken into the chapel and thrown into a roughly dug grave, but Henry VIII had given instructions for her remains to be covered in quicklime to dissolve and decompose them quicker. And this led to Catherine Howard's remains never being found inside the chapel. Now, the final royal, or queen, buried inside there is Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen who ruled after Edward VI. Jane was deposed by Queen Mary I, the oldest daughter of Henry VIII, and she remained inside the Tower of London as a prisoner, where she had been before for awaiting her coronation. It looked as if Jane would be spared, but the reality of the situation was too grave for Mary I, as Jane posed a serious threat to her reign. Lady Jane Grey was either 16 or 17 when she was executed by axe inside the Tower of London, and like Anne Boleyn, she was buried with some degree of dignity. There were many other victims of the Tower of London who were buried within the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula, including Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, who had royal blood through her uncle being King Edward IV, and there was also Jane Boleyn, who was executed alongside Catherine Howard,
Robert Devereux, the once favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, and some of the Tudor period's most notorious people. Many people who lost their heads upon Tower Hill were also buried in the chapel, including Thomas Cromwell, Sir Thomas More, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, and the illegitimate son of Charles II and Bishop John Fisher. But over the centuries following the Tudor period, the chapel fell into a state of disrepair, and it was certainly somewhere which was not fit as a royal burial site. Because of this, during the reign of Queen Victoria, there was a huge amount of renovation work performed, and this led to the exhumation of many people who were buried inside the small church. This included Anne Boleyn, whose remains were found. On the 9th of November 1876, the workers dug up and exhumed Anne Boleyn, the executed second wife of Henry VIII. Her remains had been found where they were recorded, and they were found in front of the high altar, and 5 men had gathered to exhume her. They began to lift the pavement, and at a depth of 2 feet the body of Anne Boleyn was found. Her bones had been heaped together in one spot, but the grave had been disturbed by a collapsing, decaying coffin of a 54-year-old woman named Hannah Beresford, who had been buried close to Anne in 1750. Because of the discovery of the body of the Queen, the royal doctor, Dr. Frederick Mowat, was summoned to the Tower, and his team then carefully recorded and forensically examined the remains of the Queen. Of course, they were looking for signs of a woman who had lost her head by decapitation in a brutal manner, and this is what they found, and Dr. Mowat stated of the remains that they belonged to a female between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull, and that they bore witness to the Queen's little neck. A later, more thorough examination concluded. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebra and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hand and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. Anne Boleyn's body was then placed inside of a new coffin, a small lead container, and a plaque was placed upon her coffin ready for reburial. As mentioned, the body of Catherine Howard was not found, possibly due to the quicklime which had been added on her remains upon the King's orders, this substance decomposing her remains much quicker. But they may also not have been found due to the age that she was when she was executed, and that her bones had not hardened, meaning that she would have disappeared into the ground quicker than adult bones. Lady Jane's remains were also discovered and found. The chapel's building work was completed and finished, and with this, remains were then placed back into the ground. The most prominent burials were placed under the altar, with James Scott, the illegitimate son of Charles I, being buried directly beneath it. This area below the altar became an unofficial royal burial vault, as the remains of Anne Boleyn and Lady Jane were interred directly there. There is a memorial plaque marking these sites today, as is there one for Catherine Howard, but this is just a memorial to her, and there is no remains of Henry VIII's 5th wife buried under the stones, as her remains were never found. There is also a crypt inside of the Tower of London's chapel, and this has become a place where many lesser people were interred, such as Thomas Cromwell, and this is today not accessible to the public. The remains, the corpses of Sir Thomas More, is also interred here. It's in its own tomb without a head. The chapel has been described as no sadder spot on earth than that little cemetery. Death is there associated, not as in Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's, with genius and virtue, with public veneration and with imperishable renown, not as in our humblest churches and churchyards, with everything that is most endearing in social and domestic charities, but with whatever is darkest in human nature and in human destiny, with the savage triumph of implacable enemies, with the inconstancy, the ingratitude, the cowardice of friends, and with all the miseries of fallen greatness and blighted fame. Thither have been carried through successive ages by the rude hands of jailers, without one mourner following, the bleeding relics of men who had been the captains of armies, the leaders of parties, the oracles of senates, and the ornaments of courts. Today, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula can be visited, and it is a poignant place where queens are buried. Recently, when we visited, we saw a beefeater having a quiet moment of reflection upon the gravestone and sit where Anne Boleyn was buried. A solitary red rose was laid on her grave marker out of respect for a queen who lost her head 500 years ago. It is a much quieter sight than Westminster Abbey and St. George's Chapel, but today it is still a site of royal burial.
Holyrood Abbey is today a ruined abbey, and it was founded in the early 12th century by King David I of Scotland. During the 15th century, the guest house of the abbey became a royal residence, and then this later expanded to become the Palace of Holyrood House. The abbey has been ruined since the 18th century as the roof collapsed in 2 stages, and today it still stands without a roof on. But it was here that a royal vault existed, and still today it can be found in the corner of the abbey. This vault once contained the remains of many kings and queens. Originally buried in here was King David II, who was interred in 1371, and King James II was buried there in 1460. Others interred were Arthur, the Duke of Rothesay, Madeline of Valois, the teenage bride of James V, James, the Duke of Rothesay, Arthur, the Duke of Albany, King James V, the father of Mary, Queen of Scots, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, Mary, Queen of Scots' husband, Margaret, the daughter of James VI, and Mary of Geldres, and a child of King James II. But during the Anglo-Scottish Wars, during the reign of King Henry VIII, the English attacked the abbey and they sacked it, and they broke into the royal vaults. They caused a huge amount of damage and they ransacked the burials, destroying many of the coffins and decoration inside of the vault. Later, a Protestant mob in 1559 did the same, breaking into the church and causing further damage, and they also destroyed the altars on this occasion. Because of the damage and destruction, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland decided to demolish the east end of the abbey's church, and the royal tombs and coffins were removed to a new burial vault which was constructed on the south side of the nave. But this would not be the end of the desecration. Towards the end of King James VII's reign, this vault was ransacked, and it was said that the contents of the vault were left in disorder, and it's presumed that the coffins and remains were scattered and left in a terrible way. One man who visited Holyrood in the 17th century and looked inside of the royal vault later claimed, in the month of January 1683 was discovered accidentally by removing some seats in the church of Holyrood, the vault on the south-east end of the church, where the body of King James V lies buried. John Keane and others in their chronologies, the Scots king tells us he was buried at Holyrood House, but the length of time and negligence had worse the particular place out of the memory of men. It was known to be him by an inscription on his leaden coffin. I had the curiosity to go and view the relics of the gallant prince. In the Pend of Cell there are 6 lead coffins. The first is King James V, who died in the year 1542, but Drummond of Hawthorndean is in the very end of his life tells us this is not the place where he was first interred, but that King Henry VIII's army, having defeated and defaced his tomb and monument, he was transported into this vault by King James VI and re-embalmed, which appears by the freshness of his body and the liquor about him. The second is his queen, Magdalene, daughter to Francis I, King of France, who died in 1537. The third is Henry Lord Darnley, father to King James VI and Queen Mary's husband, who was strangled in 1567. By his body he appears to have been a very tall, proper man. Others call this body Signor David Rizzio, the Italian musician. The fourth is Lady Jean Stuart, daughter to King James V and Countess of Agril, who died in 1587. The other two are some of their children. He later went on to state, "This was a humbling and mortifying sight, and a great instance and document of mortality and vanity of the world, all the glory of the sprightly prince being crowded into this lowly cell. Many ordinary persons have better burial places than what this restless prince got." He then, it's believed, looked inside the coffins too and claimed, "All the inhabitants of that dark wall have lean and pale cheeks, hollow eyes, fallen noses, and none of them wear the jewels and other deckings with which they glistened when they were of life. We must all rise again at the great day of accounts of kings of old, but very meanly entombed." Because of the state of this royal burial vault, in 1898, Queen Victoria ordered a repair of the vault once and for all, and it was stated that the remains of the burial should have been given some dignity. Because of this, the remains were all collected up. They were placed inside of this new wooden box, presumably all mixed up. One thing to also mention is that the remains of Mary of Gueldres, the Queen of King James II, was actually interred inside the vault later in 1848, as they were moved from Trinity Church in Edinburgh. These were kept inside of separate coffins. Compared with the burial vaults of Westminster Abbey, the vault inside of Holyrood Abbey was desecrated many times and it was ransacked. The vault that stands today was created later, and this was subjected to a significant amount of destruction too. Inside of Holyrood Abbey, this vault still exists, and the bones have all been collected to be placed inside of one large coffin. One of the most influential and notorious royal families in history was the Tudors, and their kings and queens would change the face of England forever. Henry VIII was known for his brutality, and he would have 6 wives, 2 of whom he executed inside the walls of the Tower of London. But Henry was never meant to have been king. It was his father, Henry VII, who founded the Tudor dynasty and ended the Wars of the Roses by marrying Elizabeth of York. But Henry VII reigned for a period of around 24 years, and he brought a lot of stability to the throne. But he died at the age of 52, leaving England in the hands of his son, Henry VIII, who would bring the nation under a significant number of changes himself. But did you know that Henry VII's burial vault was opened a number of times throughout the years? Henry VII became the King of England by the right of conquest, and he then married Elizabeth of York to unite the warring factions of the Wars of the Roses and to bring an end to decades of disputes over the rightful king. Some saw Henry as a usurper who had dethroned the rightful King Richard, but he faced a number of rebellions in the years after that came in the form of pretenders, with these claiming they were the princes in the Tower, or Edward V, the boy king who had disappeared from sight inside the Tower of London. He managed to put them down and would show a ruthless side, as he had some of his enemies executed. This showed that Henry VII was someone not to be crossed. Henry was not someone who knew how to run a nation, and he had a number of close advisors who helped him do this. He was more prudent than other monarchs, and he made the crown very rich, through raising taxes and increasing the ruthlessness in which these were collected. But some people were not happy to pay this. Henry VII was a man who was very shrewd, and throughout his reign one of the major boom industries was wool and cloth inside of England, and this was then traded around the world. He also increased his stranglehold over law and order, introducing justices of peace to make sure the nation's laws were being adhered to. Henry VII, despite having differing popularity, did manage to increase stability in the monarchy following the Civil War. But in 1502, Elizabeth of York and Henry VII's first son, Arthur, died. He was the heir to the throne and was very much the man expected to become the next Tudor king. He had died following his marriage to Catherine of Aragon inside of Ludlow Castle and passed away from the sweating sickness. This loss hurt the king greatly, and for a man who rarely showed any emotion in public, he was overwhelmed by grief. Henry VII would cry uncontrollably at court. However, further heartbreak came a year later as his wife, Elizabeth of York, died inside the Tower of London. She had just given birth, but days later both Elizabeth and the child died, and with this Henry VII was devastated and he shut himself away, and it was said he himself became very ill and almost died from this unknown illness. It was said the only woman who could bring him out of his upset was his mother, but following Elizabeth's death, he did consider remarrying. In February of 1508, it was noted that the king was suffering from gout, and it was also reported months later that he was in the last stages of consumption. Writers of the time noted how, in the final years of his life, that Henry VII had become sicker more often and that things were getting more serious each time. It was also reported around this time that Henry VII was very ill and in extremis, and that he was very ill without hope of recovery. But the king managed to battle on as long as he could, and by the end of March 1509 he knew that death was on the horizon, and he drafted his last will and testament. The decline in the king's health was brought about by the fact he was grieving his wife and his son, and many of his close friends and loyal advisers also around this time became sick and ill. With this, Henry VII made sure there would be a seamless transition of power for his son Henry VIII to come onto the throne after his death. Accounts of the death of Henry VII mostly come from Bishop John Fisher. He stated that he said how 2 nights before the king's death he became so weak that he could not hear mass at the altar and had struggled for some time to eat and drink. However, he was keen to do his religious duty, and he summoned his confessor to his bedside to hear the sacrament. Mass at his bedside was heard. At Henry it was said to have been a very moving spectacle. It was said that those who witnessed Henry receiving the sacrament were moved with a marvellous compassion and flow of tears, that at some time they wept and sobbed by the space of 3/4 of an hour. On the day of his death he heard Mass again, and this time held the crucifix a number of times with great reverence, embracing it tenderly and kissing it. He was in a significant amount of pain and was suffering and scared, and he in his final moments appealed to Jesus to deliver his soul and to protect him. It was said he claimed, "O my blessed Jesus, O my Lord, deliver my soul from the misery of this world, deliver my soul from these deadly pains, deliver my could from this corruptible body." In his final moments, the king's son, Prince Henry, who was just 17 at the time, was summoned to his father's bedside for his final instructions, and the king said, "Fatherly and godly exhortations committed unto him the laborious governance of this realm of England." However, the original plan was for Henry VII to be buried inside of Windsor, and work had begun on rebuilding part of the chapel as a tomb house, but this was never finished. However, the Lady Chapel inside of Westminster Abbey was being remodelled also, and this would become the resting place of Henry VII. His wife, Elizabeth of York, had been interred in a grave near the new Lady Chapel, but following Henry VII's death, the pair were then interred inside of a large burial vault in the heart of the chapel before the altar and opposite the tomb of Henry's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. But Henry VII's tomb was actually placed in an eastern position in the chapel, presumably by Henry VIII, to then make way for his own burial. The tomb cost a huge sum of £1,500 and was made by Pietro Torrengiano of Florence. The monument has a black marble tomb chest and is ornamented with copper gilt, and also features the bronze effigies of the king and his queen. Henry VII and Elizabeth's coffins were buried here in a vault beneath the monument and tomb, and this vault is 2.7 metres long and 1.5 metres wide and high, and it is not the smallest. The lead coffins were covered with symbols such as Maltese crosses. However, the burial vault of Henry VII was broken into a number of times. The vault was opened first in 1603, and this was hugely significant as the body of Elizabeth I and her coffin was placed inside the same vault. Because of the size of the vault, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's coffin may have had to have been moved to the side. Elizabeth I's burial inside the same vault was significant as it was marking her as a very important Tudor monarch and one of the greatest, and it was an honour for her in death. However, she would not be laid to rest for long, as when James I came onto the throne, he ordered her to be buried in a vault with her half-sister, Mary I. Elizabeth I's coffin was removed and reburied elsewhere in Westminster Abbey, and then following the death of James I, his body was then interred inside of Henry VII's burial vault himself. It's almost as if James had Elizabeth I moved for himself. To incorporate James I's coffin, the outer wooden shells of Henry VII's coffin and Elizabeth of York's were removed to make room, and this left the first Tudor king and queen inside of their lead cases. But also at this point, the visceral urns of Henry and Elizabeth may have been moved elsewhere. These were the boxes and urns that held the hearts and internal organs of the king and queen after their death, and they were removed during the embalming process. But again, the vault of Henry VII would be opened one more time in 1869 by the curious Dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley. He was looking for the coffin of James I, and of course he found this alongside Henry VII, and he commented on the lead shrouded body of Henry VII. He also sketched what he saw, and it was rather disturbing of an image, with the three shrouded bodies lying inside the vault eerily. Henry VII is remembered for being a steady king who brought stability following the Wars of the Roses. He was a man who would not spend too much during his reign, and he lived within his means, but taxed his population harshly at times, making the crown very rich. He would be buried inside the heart of his new mausoleum, the Lady Chapel, and he hoped that this would become a Tudor mausoleum for centuries to come. Within a century of his death, the Tudor period came to an end, and it would be the death of his granddaughter, Elizabeth I, who brought an end to the Tudor period. It was January 1547 that King Henry VIII took to his deathbed. His servants remained closely, and things were kept very secret that the king was taking his final breaths. He was told by one of his closest friends and courtiers, Sir Anthony Denny, that he should remember his sins like a good Christian, and Henry VIII even acknowledged that throughout his life he had committed a number of terrible sins and actions, such as even executing his wives, but Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, was called upon to give the king some spiritual guidance and to oversee the final preparations for his death. He was delayed by poor weather crossing the River Thames, and he managed to get to the palace before the king slipped away. The final breaths and moments of Henry VIII were calm, and have been described as, at the end there was no master and servant, no prince or churchman, just a priest preparing a departing soul for eternity. Cranmer begged Henry to give a sign that he trusted Christ for salvation, and in response he felt the grip on his hand tighten slightly. It was an evangelical departure, no anointing, no reading of Latin prayer, just a simple acknowledgement of the all-sufficient atoning work of Christ. Cranmer would have been glad of that. At roughly 2 a.m. on the 28th of January 1547, King Henry VIII died. His death was kept very quiet, as it was said that a kingdom that did not have a ruler of king was one vulnerable to attack. Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, would become his successor, and the death was then announced days later in Parliament. It was stated that before the Lord of the King's Majesty Privy Council, and there was declared to them by my Lord Chancellor and other the death of the King Majesty. Henry VIII, our sovereign Lord, which deceased to Almighty God on Friday last, being the 28th of January, and straitly charging them to keep the King's peace and to look to the safeguard of the King's majestic chamber of London, and so they departed. Wriothesley also said that the same day in the afternoon the King's Majesty Edward VI came to the Tower of London, and rode in Aldgate, and so along the wall by the crossed friars to the Tower Hill, and he entered at the Red Bulwark, where Sir John Cage, Constable of the Tower, received his Majesty on horseback. Our late sovereign King Henry VIII declared by his will under his great seal his dearly beloved son and heir, our sovereign lord, now Edward VI, to succeed to the crown imperial. Sir Edward Seymour to be Lord Protector and Governor of the King's Majesty and the realm of England until the King's Majesty comes to his lawful age of 18 years. Inside of the Palace of Whitehall, Henry VIII's body was embalmed, and it was then placed inside of a coffin. The heart and entrails of the king were removed and buried elsewhere, inside of a different vessel, and the body laid in state within the presence chamber of Whitehall. On the 14th of February, roughly 2 weeks after his death, Henry VIII's funeral took place, and the body was taken from Whitehall to Windsor Castle, and specifically St George's Chapel, where it was to be buried alongside the coffin of his third wife, Jane Seymour. The procession to the chapel was massive, and it was said of this that the vast coffin, covered with powls of blue velvet and cloth of gold, lay on a chariot drawn by black caparisoned horses, who drew it along roads that had been swept and even widened for the occasion. On top of the coffin was a wax effigy of the king, carved by Nicholas Bellin and clad in crimson velvet, trimmed with miniver. On its head was a crown atop a nightcap of black satin, set full of precious stones. It wore jewelled bracelets and velvet gloves adorned with rings. Henry VIII's coffin, following the funeral, was buried and placed inside the burial vault found inside the choir of St George's Chapel. The coffin, which may have already been damaged, was then placed next to Jane Seymour's, and it was not disturbed until the following century, in the aftermath of the English Civil War. King Charles I, the executed Stuart, had his coffin squashed into the small burial vault, and the decision to bury him here took place as it was secret, and it prevented Charles, his former supporters, getting their hands on his body. Henry's coffin was much bigger and larger, and it was moved to the side, and the trestle that it was sat on broke during this, and it was also said that the coffin lid had splintered and cracked open, and because of this, the face of Henry VIII could be espied through the hole, and his beard could still be seen remaining on his face. But some of the remains of the Tudor king, because of the exposure, had decayed significantly and were skeletal. As mentioned, the Tudor king's damaged coffin was pushed to the side, but yet again the burial vault would be opened again to bury a small child of Queen Anne, the final Stuart queen, and this small coffin was laid here at the feet of Henry VIII. In the 1800s, the burial vault of Henry VIII was discovered again, and this was done as officials tried to search for the coffin and the body of King Charles I. Prince Regent, the future George IV, oversaw the opening of the burial vault, and in this the coffin next to Henry's was opened. It was said that those who sought for the tomb were baffled. In 1813, however, in making some alterations under the choir of the chapel, an opening was accidentally made through the wall of the vault in which King Henry's body had been placed, and beside the coffin of King Henry VIII, there were found to be 2 other coffins in the vault, one of Jane Seymour and the other that of Charles I. The Prince Regent, in order to clear up any doubt as to the correctness of the latter supposition, ordered that the coffin be opened and the body examined. This was done on April 1st, 1813, in the presence of the Prince Regent and several other persons. Despite the search not being for Henry VIII, the remains of King Charles I had been found, and it was said of these that, at length, the whole face was disengaged from its covering. The complexion of the skin of it was dark and discoloured. The forehead and temples had lost little or nothing of their muscular substance. The cartilage of the nose was gone, but the left eye, in the first moment of exposure, was open and full, though it vanished almost immediately. The body of King Charles I had been found centuries after his death, but this also marked the final time that the burial vault was ever opened, and the coffin of Henry VIII had been left alone since. It's known that Henry VIII's remains were in a bad way due to the damage to the coffin, and the fact that allegedly someone, a foot soldier, had even tried to steal one of the bones of Henry VIII right from the coffin. But Henry VIII still today is buried inside of that vault under the choir of St. George's Chapel, and thousands of people walk over this today when they visit the chapel, and they don't actually realise that beneath them, beneath their feet, are two of the most notorious kings ever to rule over England, buried next to each other. In the morning of the 24th of March 1603, Elizabeth I died. In her final months she had suffered significantly with depression and illness, and she saw many of her friends die, and she struggled to come to terms with this. She died at a rather grand age by the standards of the Tudor period, and had battled smallpox and other diseases as well. However, the court of the Queen didn't know what to do following her death, but in her last few days she had invited the Scottish King James to take the throne of England to unite the two nations. James was actually the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who Elizabeth had executed. Elizabeth's final days were known to have been rather dour, especially as she spent long periods of time contemplating her life and the mistakes that she had made. She was almost 70 years old when she took to her deathbed, and she was surrounded by her remaining closest friends and her advisers, and also some of her servants. The Archbishop of Canterbury was there also for her, and he gave the Queen spiritual guidance in her final moments, and he told her that she would one day rule again as a queen in heaven. But Elizabeth seemed to accept death well, but her throat did swell, and she struggled to breathe and also to speak. Now Elizabeth did leave some instructions as to what should happen to her body after her death. She did not want to be disemboweled, which was part of the embalming process, but the royal doctors and physicians chose to ignore this, and they would be a good job, as they removed some of the Queen's vital organs. They removed her heart and entrails from her body, and these were placed into a separate chest after her death. Her body was prepared for burial in the same way as it had been for centuries. It was embalmed, wrapped in many layers of cerecloth, a heavy wax-coated cloth or shroud. Elizabeth I was placed inside of a large lead-lined coffin, which was decorated with Tudor imagery, such as the rose, and when the time came for her funeral procession from Richmond Palace to the palace of her death, the central London, there was a huge spectacle. The coffin was covered in black velvet, and her ladies kept a close eye on it. It was claimed during the funeral procession that the oars at every stroke did tears let fall, and it was a very sorry sight. One onlooker wrote of the funeral procession that began on the 28th of April 1603 that the city of Westminster was surcharged with a multitude of all sorts of people in their streets, houses, leads, and gutters that came to see the obsequies. There was such a general sighing, groaning, and weeping, as the like has not been seen or known in the memory of man. Her funeral effigy, a lifelike wax and wood model of her, was on top of the coffin, dressed in her Parliament robes, and on top of the effigy's head was a crown, holding the sceptress of power. For many, this was the first time they'd seen what their queen looked like. The coffin got to Westminster Abbey, and the service for the funeral was conducted by Dean Andrews, and after this the coffin of Elizabeth was taken to the Lady Chapel for burial. She was, to begin with, actually buried within the same vault as her grandparents, King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the founders of the Tudor dynasty, which was said to have been a great honour, right at the centre of the Lady Chapel. But years later her body was moved out of here. It was her successor, James I of England, who did this, but he respected Elizabeth and wanted to pay homage and respect to her reign, and he commissioned a huge tomb to be made in her honour. This tomb was colossal and would have cost a fortune, and it was placed in a new burial spot above the burial vault of Mary I, the half-sister of Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth's coffin was placed directly on top of Mary's coffin to show her significance and dominance over Mary, even in death. The tomb today shows Elizabeth I in a recumbent pose, and when you're in the room it is remarkable. However, in 1880, a book was published by Arthur Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, and he had explained the royal burial vaults within Westminster Abbey. He had been given by Queen Victoria permission to map the abbey and locate the sites of royal coffins, and was in particularly interested in finding the coffin of King James I. He found this within Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's vault, meaning that he had moved Elizabeth out of the vault so that one day he could be buried within it. But Stanley explored many of the other chambers and vaults, and he found an aisle underground at the east end of the tomb of Elizabeth I, and he followed it, finding a small opening in the wall, where he crept through. He then entered the burial vault of Elizabeth I and Mary I. He described what he saw and stated, "The excavations, however, had almost laid bare to the wall immediately at the eastern end of the monument of Elizabeth, and through a small aperture a view which was obtained into a long narrow vault imminently beneath her tomb. It was instantly evident that it enclosed 2 coffins, and 2 only, and it could not be doubted that these contained Elizabeth and her sister Mary. The upper one larger, and more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. There was no disorder or decay, except the centering wood had fallen over the head of Elizabeth's coffin, and that the wood case had crumbled away at the sides, and had drawn away part vault of the decaying lid. No coffin plate could be discovered, but fortunately the dim light fell on a fragment of the lid slightly carved. This led to a further search, and the original inscription was discovered. There was the Tudor badge, a full double rose, deeply but simply incised in outline on the middle of the cover. On each side the august initials E.R., and below the memorable date 1603. The coffin lid had been further decorated with narrow, moulded panelling. The coffin case was of inch elm, but the ornamental lid containing the inscription and panelling was of fine oak, half an inch thick, laid on the inch elm cover. The whole was covered with red silk velvet, of which much remained attached to the wood, and it had covered not only the sides and ends, but also the ornamented oak cover, as though the bare wood had not been thought rich enough without the velvet. The sight of this secluded and narrow tomb, thus compressing in the closest grasp the 2 Tudor sisters, partners of the same throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of resurrection, the solemn majesty of the great Queen thus reposing, as can hardly be doubted by her own desire, on her sister's coffin, was the more impressive from the contrast of its quiet calm with the confused and multitudinous decay of the Stuart vault, and the fullness of its tragic interest with the vacancy of the deserted space which had been hitherto explored in other parts of the chapel. The vault was then immediately closed. This was, it's believed, the first and only time that the burial vault of Queen Elizabeth I was opened, and it has never since been entered allegedly. There was a story about a young altar boy who once allegedly touched the box inside of the vault containing Elizabeth's heart, but this is disputed. However, within the heart of Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth I is still buried, and her coffin has never been opened, meaning that still today her body may be remarkably preserved and well protected from the elements. The Scottish were appalled by the execution of King Charles I, and they would proclaim his son Charles as their king, and they invited him to come to Scotland. Cromwell would later march north and fight the Scots and capture part of Scotland, but on the 1st of January 1651 the Scots crowned Charles II at Scone, and then the English army came back to fight. The Scots fought in England too. Charles II then escaped, and he went back to France, but following the death of Cromwell, the whole idea of a Lord Protector collapsed, and Charles II spent many years in exile, until in 1660 he was invited back to London to restore his father's throne. There was a number of disastrous events during Charles II's reign, including the Great Plague of London in 1665, and then the following year, the Great Fire of London, which decimated much of the capital. England was also at war with the Dutch, and the Dutch did defeat them.
He was, as mentioned, known as the Merry Monarch, and he had huge parties and banquets, and he also had many mistresses, and he would therefore have many illegitimate children, which caused chaos as his brother then had to become his successor. Charles II was a patron of the arts, and he founded the Royal Society. However, he died on the 6th of February 1685 at the age of 54 inside the Palace of Whitehall. He had been ill for some time, and on the 3rd of January the king had a serious seizure, and every 6 hours he was given further treatments, including creams and antidotal milk water, as well as further medications and poisons. The doctors continued to bleed the king, and they took another 3/4 of a pint of blood from him, and they continued the treatment which caused his skin to bleed. He then suffered the next day from a fever, which was intermittent, and he continued to be purged and made sick, and he was further given spirit of a human skull, as well as other strange compounds. But on the Friday, 6th of February 1685, the king died. He apologised to his doctors, and he said he had taken a very long time to die, and his brother, the Duke of York, came to his side and told him not to let his mistress, Nell Gwyn, starve following his death, and he claimed, "I have suffered very much, and more than any of you can imagine. My business will shortly be done." Following seeing the rising sun, he became breathless, and another pint of blood was removed from him. He then became unconscious and died before midday. The post-mortem discovered that the king's veins on the surface of his brain were filled, and the ventricles of his heart were filled with some kind of matter, and that his heart was large and firm. There was even blood found inside of his lungs, and his liver was engorged with blood, as were his kidneys and spleen. These indicated that the king was very sick, and that he may have had a cerebral infection. But there were rumours at the time that King Charles II was poisoned. He had for some time suffered with chronic gout, and had also in his final days become very dehydrated. There was little knowledge of his condition, though, at the time, proven by the different treatments he was administered, and today his life could have been prolonged, and he could have been given a good quality of life. Following this investigation, his body was then embalmed, and his wooden coffin enclosed in a lead coffin, which was covered with purple velvet, and was left to lay in state before his burial took place inside of Westminster Abbey on the 14th of February 1685. His coffin was placed in a vault in the south aisle of King Henry VII's Lady Chapel, and his entrails, including his heart and intestines, were removed after death and placed in a box which was placed next to the coffin. On the coffin plate was the inscription, "The remains of the most noble and serene Prince Charles II, King of England, Scotland, France and Ireland, defender of the faith, etc." He died on the 6th day of February, the year of our Lord 1684, and the 55th year of his age, and the 37th of his reign. His funeral procession was rather low-key, and a life-sized wax effigy stood by his grave for over a century, and it contained a remarkable likeness to the king, and may have been cast from his face whilst he was alive. Charles II was placed in the vault that later became the Stuart vault, and he would be joined by later Stuart monarchs. Inside of this vault were placed the coffins of Queen Mary II, King William III, Prince George and Queen Anne, and also interred in this vault were their visceral urns containing their removed body parts during the embalming process of each of these monarchs and members of the royal family. Now, the Stuart vault remained undisturbed for a number of years, over a century, following the death of the final Stuart queen, Anne. However, in the year 1867, building work was occurring inside of the Lady Chapel, and near to the vault, and the entrance to the vault was accidentally discovered whilst builders were trying to install heating pipes. With this, investigators ventured into the Stuart vault, and they looked at the state of the coffins inside of there. King Charles II's was found at one end of the vault, next to the niche where his internal organs had been placed in a box. His coffin was inspected, and it was found that it was in a very bad way. Despite no one venturing inside of the vault before, the coffin was heavily damaged, and the lead plates of the coffin had fallen inwards, and this had partially exposed the remains of Charles II. When investigators peered into the coffin, they discovered that Charles II's skull was on display and could be seen, and the effect of the damage to the coffin had led to the skin on his head decaying due to the environment of the vault. The weight of the lead had caused damage to the coffin and thus exposed Charles II's remains. The fact his skull was on show also shows that his head may have not been wrapped in the cerecloth, or that he had also decayed. It was believed that his remains may have been well preserved because of the wrapping, but the skull was on display. Over the following years, the burial vault was opened a number of times, and there were no repairs done to Charles II's coffin, which have been documented. King Charles II, when he was invited to take the throne of England, following the restoration of the monarchy, oversaw a number of important but devastating events in his country. He helped to fight the Great Fire of London and dealt with the aftermath of the plague, and he may have thought that as a king he was doomed due to the chaos that these brought. But as he settled into his life as the King of England, Charles lived a very lavish life, and he spent huge amounts of money on parties and many of his royal mistresses. But in the years following his death, Charles II's coffin sustained damage that caused his remains to rot and become badly decayed. By the turn of the 20th century, Queen Victoria was an old and fragile woman. Born in 1819, she was now in her 81st year and had been on the throne since 1837. For most of her life, she had been remarkably healthy and strong-willed, but age was finally catching up with her. She suffered from failing eyesight, rheumatism in her legs, and increasing fatigue. Her final years were lived mostly in seclusion, and since the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, Victoria had never truly recovered from grief. She wore black mourning clothes for the rest of her life and rarely appeared in public. As she grew older, she became more reclusive, preferring the quiet of her private residences such as Osborne House on the Isle of Wight or Balmoral Castle in Scotland. By late 1900, her health began to worsen noticeably. She became weaker and struggled with memory loss and drowsiness. Her appetite faded, and her family and doctors could see that her long life was coming to an end. Despite this, Victoria remained mentally alert and aware that her time was near. "I am not afraid," she is said to have remarked to her doctor, "for I shall go to Albert." In December of 1900, Queen Victoria travelled to Osborne House, her favourite seaside residence on the Isle of Wight. It was a place filled with memories of Prince Albert, who had helped design it, and where they had shared some of their happiest family moments. She wished to spend her final Christmas there. The royal family gathered around her as her condition declined. Her son, the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, came to stay by her side, as did her eldest daughter, the Empress Frederick of Germany, Vicky, and many of her other children and grandchildren. The Queen's room was filled with the quiet activity of attendants and family members, and the sound of the sea could be heard through the windows. A calm and peaceful setting for the end of such a monumental life. In her final days, she drifted in and out of sleep. She was often semi-conscious and too weak to speak for long, yet she still took comfort in the presence of her family and the familiar surroundings of Osborne. Her doctors reported that she seemed content and peaceful, though her body was failing. On the evening of the 21st of January 1901, she became unconscious, and the following day at 6:30 p.m, on the 22nd of January, Queen Victoria quietly passed away. Her eldest son and heir, Albert Edward, and her grandson Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany were both present at her bedside. The Queen's doctor, Sir James Reed, recorded her final moments in his diary, noting that her breathing grew shallower until it stopped completely. The news quickly spread throughout Britain and the Empire.
Bells tolled across cities and towns, and newspapers printed solemn headlines announcing the death of the longest reigning monarch in British history up to that point. The reaction to Victoria's death was immense. To her subjects, she had been more than a queen. She had been the grandmother of the empire. Her reign had seen Britain rise to global dominance through industrial power, colonial expansion, and military successes. She had also presided over major social changes, the growth of democracy, new inventions, and the rise of the middle class. When she died, people across the world mourned her as the figure who had represented moral certainty and national pride. Newspapers in London described her as the mother of her people, while others called her the last of the great monarchs. One journalist wrote simply, "The old world is gone." Foreign leaders also paid tribute. The Kaiser of Germany wept openly for his grandmother. President Theodore Roosevelt of the United States sent condolences, and in India, thousands gathered in temples and churches to pray for her soul. It was clear the death of Queen Victoria marked more than the end of a life. It was the end of an age. Her passing symbolised the fading of the 19th century, and with it confidence and empire building, and the dawn of a new and uncertain 20th century. Despite her long reign, Queen Victoria had very clear and personal wishes for her funeral, and they were far from traditional. She did not want a dark, mournful state funeral like those of her predecessors. Instead, she requested a military funeral, in honour of her position as head of the armed forces, and she wanted it to be as bright and as white as possible. She left specific written instructions, known as her Instructions for My Death, which she had drafted years earlier. She asked to be buried in white rather than black, and to be dressed in her wedding veil and gown, symbolising her reunion with Prince Albert. She also requested that certain sentimental items be placed in her coffin: a plaster cast of Albert's hand, photographs of her children, and a lock of his hair. But perhaps most touching of all, she asked that her late servant and confidant, John Brown, not be forgotten. She had treasured his friendship during her long widowhood, and though his relationship with her is controversial, she kept a lock of his hair, a small photograph, and his mother's wedding ring, all of which were placed in her coffin, besides Albert's mementos. Victoria's coffin was laid in state at Osborne House for a few days, so that her household staff could pay their respects, and on the 1st of February 1901, it was carried on the royal yacht Alberta and sailed across the Solent to the mainland. The journey was watched by crowds who lined the shore to bid farewell to their queen. From Gosport, her coffin was placed on a special funeral train bound for London. The train was draped in black and moved slowly through the countryside, greeted by mourners at every station. When it reached Paddington, the coffin was taken in procession through the streets to Paddington Station, then on to Victoria Station, and finally to Windsor. Tens of thousands lined the route in silence, with shopkeepers lowering their shutters and people removing their hats as the procession passed. Soldiers, sailors, and the colonial troops from across the empire marched alongside, representing the global reach of her reign. Her funeral service took place at St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, on the 2nd of February 1901. The chapel was filled with family members, foreign royalty, and dignitaries. The Archbishop of Canterbury led the prayers, and the music was solemn yet simple, exactly as she had wished. After the funeral service, Queen Victoria's coffin was taken to the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore, near to Windsor, where she was buried beside Prince Albert. The mausoleum had been built decades earlier at her command after Albert's death, and it was there that she had long wished to rest. Her coffin was placed directly beside his, symbolising their reunion that she had yearned for since 1861. On her tomb, the words Victoria R.I. were inscribed, Regina Imperatrix, meaning Queen and Empress, titles that captured both her power and her dignity. Now this is where we have to question what the state of her burial vault is like. Under the effigies of her and Albert on the tomb, there is a vault in which the two coffins were placed. Now it's known that there are other spaces inside the vault, and in particular these were saved for the children of Victoria, whom she hoped would be buried in the same vault as her. But none of them are,
and inside the vault it would be very cold and damp. You see, Frogmore sits on the site of a natural marsh, and this means the ground is very wet and often flooded and saturated with water. Over the decades, the mausoleum has become so damp-ridden it's actually damaged the fabric of the building, and a great deal of repair work has also taken place. Now, as the vault is underground, containing the coffin of Victoria, this could easily have become flooded, as the technology at the time in which the mausoleum was built did not take into consideration water issues. If the vault is waterlogged, this would mean the damp would have affected the coffin, and this could have caused Victoria's remains within the wooden structure to have decomposed quickly, and thus rotted despite the fact she would have been embalmed, and her remains would have been treated before being placed into the coffin. Prince Albert's coffin would also have suffered the same fate. The burial vault is very empty as well, meaning it is just a large stone chamber with 2 coffins inside of it. Now, to check the state of the damp, engineers may have entered the vault many times to see the damage caused by it, but the vault would become the first room and chamber to be affected by the water too, meaning the walls would be very cold, and there has never been any work done to the vault which has been documented to combat this. Because of this, we must consider that over the past century, the remains of Queen Victoria and her coffin may have certainly been heavily damaged by the conditions of the mausoleum, and that damp may have entered the coffin. This is a very sad state of affairs, considering she was at the time a woman who ruled over the British Empire, which spanned a huge part of the globe. Victoria's wish was to be buried, though, inside a grand mausoleum next to her husband Albert, and in this regard her wishes were adhered to, and she got what she wanted. Queen Elizabeth II was born on the 21st of April 1926, never expecting to become queen, but after her uncle, Edward VIII, abdicated in 1936, her father became King George VI, and she became heir to the throne. When her father died in 1952, the young Elizabeth ascended to the throne at just 25 years old. Her coronation in 1953 was a landmark event, the first to be televised, and it made her one of the most recognisable figures in the world. For 70 years she reigned through immense change. She was queen during the end of the British Empire, the Cold War, the digital revolution, and even the COVID-19 pandemic. Through it all, she became a steady presence, someone who seemed to embody the nation itself. Her image was on coins, stamps, banknotes, and even biscuit tins. To millions, she represented continuity, tradition, and a quiet sense of duty that transcended politics. By the time Queen Elizabeth reached her mid-90s, she had become visibly frailer, yet she continued to work, carrying out virtual audiences and meeting dignitaries. In 2021, her beloved husband, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, died at the age of 99 after more than 73 years of marriage. The Queen attended his funeral under strict COVID restrictions, sitting alone in St George's Chapel, an image that deeply moved the public. In the months following Philip's death, her own health began to decline. She cancelled several public engagements due to mobility issues and appeared increasingly delicate. Despite these challenges, she remained determined to serve until the very end, and in June of 2022, the United Kingdom celebrated her Platinum Jubilee, marking 70 years on the throne. It was a moment of national pride and emotion. Though she appeared only briefly on the Buckingham Palace balcony, her presence delighted crowds who gathered in their thousands. Her final public act came on the 6th of September 2022, when she met with outgoing Prime Minister Boris Johnson and appointed Liz Truss as his successor. The meeting took place at Balmoral Castle in Scotland rather than Buckingham Palace, a sign of her declining mobility. A photograph released from that day showed her smiling, using a walking stick but noticeably frail. Few realised it would be the last image of her alive. 2 days later, on the 8th of September 2022, Buckingham Palace released an unusual statement. Doctors were concerned for Her Majesty's health, This rare communication immediately drew attention. News anchors adopted sombre tones and family members began to travel to Scotland. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, and Princess Anne were already at Balmoral. Prince William, Prince Andrew, Prince Edward, and Sophie, Countess of Wessex, rushed to join them. Prince Harry, who happened to be in the UK for an event, also made the journey north, though he arrived after her passing. At Balmoral, surrounded by family and her closest staff, Queen Elizabeth II died peacefully that afternoon. She was 96 years old. The official time of death was recorded as 3:10 p.m. BST. The cause of death, according to her death certificate later released by the National Records of Scotland, was simply old age. Her death marked not only the passing of a monarch, but the end of a living link to Britain's wartime generation. She had served as head of state under 15 prime ministers, from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss, and had met every US president since Harry Truman, except Lyndon B. Johnson. At 6:30 p.m, the BBC interrupted its programming to announce her death. Newsreader Hugh Edwards, dressed in black, solemnly read the statement from Buckingham Palace. The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow. Across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, tributes poured in immediately. Crowds began to gather outside Buckingham Palace, laying flowers and lighting candles. The rain fell softly as people sang God Save the Queen. In a matter of hours, the new monarch was proclaimed King Charles III. World leaders also paid tribute. US President Joe Biden called her a stateswoman of unmatched dignity, while French President Emmanuel Macron said she embodied the British nation's continuity and unity for over 70 years. Landmarks across the world, from the Eiffel Tower to the Empire State Building, were illuminated in her honour. The Queen's death triggered Operation London Bridge, the detailed plan long prepared for this moment. Flags were lowered to half-mast and church bells rang across the country. The words "London Bridge is down" were the coded message sent to government officials to begin the carefully choreographed days of mourning. Her coffin remained at Balmoral for several days, draped in the Royal Standard of Scotland and adorned with a wreath of flowers. Members of the royal household and local staff were given a chance to say goodbye. The Queen's body was then taken by road to Edinburgh, passing through small towns where crowds lined the streets in silence. At the Palace of Holyrood, her coffin rested overnight before being carried in a solemn procession along the Royal Mile to St Giles's Cathedral. Thousands of mourners filed past her coffin during a 24-hour vigil, paying their respects. After this, her coffin was flown to London aboard the Royal Air Force's plane, greeted by Prime Minister Liz Truss and members of the royal family. It was then taken to Buckingham Palace and later to Westminster Hall, where she lay in state for 4 days. During the laying in state, the queue of mourners stretched for miles along the River Thames, at times reaching 10 miles long. People waited up to 24 hours to pass her coffin, some through the freezing night. More than 250,000 people were estimated to have filed past her casket, bowing their heads or quietly weeping as they paid their final respects. Inside of Westminster Hall, the Queen's coffin rested on a raised platform called a cataflask, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, orb and sceptre. Soldiers from units that had served her personally stood guard in the solemn vigil, including members of the household cavalry and the yeoman warders from the Tower of London. On the 19th of September 2022, the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II took place, the first since that of Sir Winston Churchill in 1965. The service was held at Westminster Abbey, where she had been married and crowned, bringing her life's journey its full circle. Heads of state, royalty, and dignitaries from around the world attended, including US President Joe Biden, Japan's Emperor Naruhito, and many European monarchs. An estimated 4.1 billion people worldwide watched the ceremony, making it the most viewed broadcast in history. After the service, her coffin was carried through London on a gun carriage,
followed by King Charles III and members of the royal family. Crowds lined the streets in silence while Big Ben tolled and cannon fire echoed from Hyde Park. The procession then travelled to Windsor, where a committal service took place at St George's Chapel, the same place her husband Philip had been buried the previous year. Later that evening, in a private family ceremony, the Queen was laid to rest beside him in the King George VI Memorial Chapel, alongside her parents and her sister, Princess Margaret. Now the King George VI Memorial Chapel was actually commissioned by Elizabeth II, as she wanted a suitable place to inter her father and mother following their deaths. With this, a small chapel was built onto the side of St George's in Windsor, and in the centre is a small underground burial vault. This vault has enough space for 6 coffins, as in 3 monarchs and their consorts. This means that presumably Charles III will be interred in the same vault with his consort Camilla, and then this vault will be full up. Elizabeth II's sister Margaret had her ashes placed in the vault, and she was cremated, with one reason for this being there was little space in the vault for her. The vault contains the coffins stacked on top of each other. For example, King George is interred in the vault. On top of his coffin is his wife's coffin. Elizabeth II's husband, Prince Philip, who died in 2021, had been placed inside of the royal vault following his funeral, as presumably it was known the Queen herself was ill and probably did not have many more years to live. When the time came to inter Elizabeth II in the vault, Philip's coffin was brought from the royal vault and was then lowered into the King George VI Memorial Chapel. He may have been placed underneath as he died before Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's coffin may sit on top. A ledger stone was then secured over the vault, showing who was buried there. The vault is nothing spectacular, just a small stone hole in the ground in which the ledger stone sits on top. At the bottom of the slab are fixings in which the vault can be lifted and opened for inspection or interment of the next monarch. The vault will be cool, as it's underground, and it's not believed there have been any lights or electricity placed within it to shine onto the coffins. Also, this is not accessible from any other way than taking the ledger stone off, and it is not connected to the much larger and much more populated main royal vault within St George's Chapel. Today, Queen Elizabeth II lies in the manner that she would have wanted to, at rest next to her father, King George VI, her mother Elizabeth, and her husband, Prince Philip, as well as the ashes of her sister, Margaret. To save space, the coffins of the monarchs and their consorts are placed on top of each other, and there is space for 2 more burials, this being presumably for Elizabeth II's heir, at the time of writing, the current monarch and his consort. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.